Hey, it's Jared with Gear and Light. Today we're going to be reviewing the Panasonic Lumix GH6. Now, for those of you that are interested, I also did a comparison between this camera and the A7 IV, and that was a fun comparison, and I actually shot some of the video on each camera and have some examples there in case you are interested. But as far as my review of this camera, the reason that I decided to do a standalone review is because I have a lot more to say about this camera, and I want to share my thoughts and opinions as someone who has been a photo and a video shooter for a long time, since about 2005, and I've been shooting on Sony since the A7S first came out. While watching what Panasonic has been doing with the GH line of cameras, and have seen the GH cameras in the professional shooting scenarios quite often, and a lot of people who shoot video primarily swear by these cameras, and so I really I had to try one out finally, and so this is my review of the GH6. So let's start by talking about the camera and the lens combination that I have here for my testing. We've got, of course, the GH6, and then we have the 25 to 50 lens. This lens is beautiful and built well, and with a maximum aperture of f1.7. I mean, it's an amazing lens. I was super excited because one of the things that has always caught my attention is some of the lenses that are available for Micro Four Thirds, specifically, used mostly with this camera or this particular line of camera. And I've been jealous because an f1.7 on a zoom lens, absolutely fantastic. And I really did enjoy shooting photos and shooting video with this combination. I think this is a real winning combination because this lens kind of gives me the 24 to 70 millimeter vibes on a full frame, even though this is a bit more zoomed in, a bit longer of a focal length than a 24 to 70 just because of the Micro Four Thirds crop. You're not getting 25 to 50. You for sure are getting, a lot more than that. I haven't done the math, but with this camera combination and with this lens, I've really enjoyed the images that I've been able to get out of this camera. So with that said, let's talk about this setup. This camera body is a bit chunky. It is a thick camera body. It gives you a lot to hold on to. And there's a lot of really pronounced buttons and knobs, which I like. And I think that they've moved more in this direction of a little bit bigger, because when you're out shooting, you need to be able to get to your buttons, you need access, and you can't have them crammed too close together. And touchscreen menus on these small screens just are too hard to fiddle with when you're in a shooting environment. You need to be able to get to stuff quick. And so I appreciate the fact that there is a lot to hold on to here. Now, I'm not going to say the button layout is perfect. When hand holding, the record button is, I don't know if they designed it to be thumb activated, to be able to hit the record button with your thumb. It's not too natural for me to do that because a lot of times I'm like working my focus point on the back of the camera, and then I have to readjust and get up to that record button. Yes, I do know and recognize that there is an additional record button on the front of the camera down here, but the record buttons probably could be placed a little bit better just so that I could either be using the shutter button with an index or a record button with the index. I think one finger utilizing that function, whether you're shooting photos or video, is enough to remember. But nonetheless, a nice red button for recording makes it easy to identify even in darker lit situations where it might be harder to see things. Big mode dial on the camera that is lockable, which is nice. Lots of buttons that are quick access, which is great for white balance, ISO, exposure compensation. It's great to have those buttons right there because a lot of times when they're a custom function button, like a C1, C2 or whatnot, it's hard to remember which ones are which. It's easier when they're nice and labeled, and these are buttons that I'm going to use, and I think most of us are always going to be using. So I do appreciate the fact that they're there and they're labeled appropriately, and so we're not, if you're shooting professionally, sometimes you're shooting on all sorts of different cameras, and remembering all of those button locations on different cameras can be tricky. So I appreciate the labeled buttons. And then, of course, for your shooting, continuous shooting modes and time shooting modes, over on the left, there's a dial for that as well, which, being that this camera is not the best for shooting photos, I would rather, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if this button is super useful or this toggle is super useful for me, but nonetheless, it's there. On the back of the camera, we of course have some additional buttons. We have the ability to go between manual focus, continuous, and single really easily here. I love that because a lot of times you do need to take control over your GH6 and throw it into manual focus mode. We'll talk more about that shortly here. We have an AF on, a D-pad, some quick menu access. We've got a rotating rotary dial here and a few additional buttons. A few buttons over here on the left, including a lock switch so we can lock our buttons down and not accidentally make any changes. And then what I think is probably the marvel of technology that this camera has is the tilt screen that also flips out. And so we've got a screen that does both things for both camps. If you guys have been around for any point of time on this channel, you know that I'm not a fan of flip out screens because I do prefer a screen that tilts. But given the possibilities of having both, I would take both all the time. And I've talked about the fact that we need this. The technology is there, and Panasonic proved it with the GH6 that we can have a tilt-up screen on the back for people like me who shoot straight down the camera and want to be looking straight down their camera and not off to the side of their camera. And then for those who are shooting more selfie, or even in a situation like this where I'm looking straight forward at a camera and want to see my screen, we've got the tilt out for that. And so kudos to Panasonic for doing this. It does add a little bit of thickness to the back of the camera, but it is what it is. And then over on this side of the camera, we have air vents here for cooling. We've got our microphone jack up here on the top, out of the way of the flip out screen. So even when the flip out screen rotates all the way around, what's nice is that we're not hitting the microphone jack and we're also not hitting the headphone jack. And so we've got plenty of clearance for both of those. But of course, it gets a little tricky down here with our USB-C and our HDMI. Those obviously are going to get in the way of the screen, but we do have a full-size HDMI, which is fantastic. So also on the front of the camera, as I mentioned before, we have a record button. On the inside here by the grip, we have two buttons, one more towards the top, one down towards the bottom. Those buttons can be customized so that you can use them for whatever purposes. We've got a battery door down here on the bottom. And that is about it as far as the body goes. The screen resolution on the back of the camera is really good. I've enjoyed using the back screen on the camera for monitoring my shots, for playing back photos and video that I have shot to see how good the shot was. Looks really good. The viewfinder, or the EVF, also is really nice. It's got a high refresh rate, it is decent resolution, and it's nice to use in those scenarios where you need to look through the eyepiece, whether you're shooting photos or if you are shooting video. Sometimes in situations where I'm a little more run and gun and I really need to focus, like I will put the camera up and I'm shooting video through the EVF, and it works really well, and high resolution, high refresh rate, like I said. So that is the camera body, and of course this lens I touched on a little bit, just really enjoying it. We also have a slip for manual focus, autofocus. I like that it hides all of the numbers, and then when you go into manual or back into autofocus, it hides them. So that way it's just clean. It just makes the lens look really clean. You got your measurements, and then they're hidden when you're not using them. And then we have a manual aperture ring, and then of course the zoom ring back here. And I love lenses that do not extend or nothing changes when you are zooming in and out. And of course this is a maximum aperture of f1.7 through the full zoom range. So let's talk about using this camera as a photo camera. Now, as a photo camera, it takes really nice photos. They're about 25 megapixel photos, so they're not massive, but they're good enough for most scenarios. This camera takes beautiful images. However, the images are sometimes crippled by the fact that autofocus is not always that accurate and takes a while. Autofocus is slow on this camera. It has contrast detect autofocus only, and it's some of the slower contrast detect autofocus that I've experienced. It doesn't do a good job of following people, and this is not going to be the camera you're going to want to use for action shots or things where anybody's moving. Yes, you could totally use it for portraits and photos where people are rather stationary and you don't have to worry about the camera doing much autofocus. I highly recommend using a select point autofocus and using the D-pad on the back to pinpoint where you want autofocus to be so the camera doesn't have as much thinking to do. So that way it's not using the entire sensor and thinking, you know, what should I be autofocusing on? It knows all it needs to do is autofocus on that pinpoint, which still it's not fast. When you put this camera into continuous focus, it is not continuous focusing nearly as fast as most competitors' cameras that are pretty much follow focusing and staying locked on to whatever subject it is that you have either face detect autofocus on, or you've got that pinpoint single point autofocus. This camera takes its time and it doesn't always get it right. I find myself often having to hit the AF on button to kind of wake it up and tell it, like, no, you're not in focus. You need to keep trying until you get it right. And it usually does get it right pretty quickly once I hit that button. But a lot of times it struggles, and I couldn't rely on this camera in a professional environment where things are happening fast and I need my camera to respond fast. So photo-wise, I love the color in the images that I'm getting out of this camera. You know, when the focus is good and everything is the situation is right, I love the images that I'm getting out of this camera. I have no complaints about that at all. Autofocus just is not something that I could not rely on autofocus with this camera in a professional environment. And even in just hobbyist environments, it's frustrating as well. So let's talk about video, which is where the true power of this camera is. Of course, it can shoot up to 5.7K at 60p. Insane at 10-bit 422, which is just insane, and it can do that internal. It shoots ProRes internal, which is probably one of the biggest deals of this camera at its price point, is that it shoots ProRes internally. You take that card out, you put it in your MacBook Pro or your M1 Mac Mini or whatever you've got, and you are off to the races, editing and rendering footage super fast in software like Final Cut Pro. This camera being able to do that internally at the price point of the camera is a huge, huge thing. Most other cameras you're going to spend around the price of this camera, if not more, and you're going to need something like an Atomos Ninja recorder to get ProRes out of it, and maybe even a few other accessories, and you're still not going to get 5.7K. Of course, this camera does 4K 120p, and it has a variety of other shooting modes as well. And so video-wise, this camera gives you pretty much everything that you're going to need for any shooting environment as far as shooting modes and shooting frame rate qualities and all that stuff. I mean, it has all of them. And at this price point, it's just not found out there at all. So video, as far as shooting video with this camera, I have similar opinion with this camera that I had when I talked about shooting photos. Most of the time when I'm shooting, I am relying on autofocus to some extent. Maybe not all the time. A lot of times I am manual focused, especially if I'm shooting a sit-down talk interview style video. I'm going to lock off my focus on that subject so the camera doesn't lose focus on accident. If I'm shooting something where there isn't a whole lot of movement, often I will shoot manual focus because I just don't want the camera to lose the subject and miss an opportunity there as the camera thinks maybe it should be focusing on something else. However, most of the time when I'm shooting events, when I used to shoot weddings, when I shoot a music video or something like that, I am relying on autofocus to some extent, depending on what it is that I'm shooting in the moment. And having accurate autofocus is extremely important. And this camera, unfortunately, just does not have fast and accurate autofocus. Like, you cannot buy this camera and expect it to do that. I've tried it in so many different environments. I've been using this camera for over a month, and I have not at all really been able to rely on it as far as autofocus goes. As I mentioned, I'm always hitting that AF on button. A lot of times, if there's any subject that moves relatively quickly, the camera is not staying locked onto them, and the camera is not tracking them with continuous autofocus. It is not something that I can rely upon. I'm very thankful for this big switch here, because all the time I was slamming it into manual focus and then taking over and controlling. Or, you know, with this lens, really, I just pull back and then take control. I don't even have to switch it out of continuous. I can just slam this back and start manual focusing right away. And a lot of times I had to do that in order to get my shot and not lose an opportunity there. However, the video that came out of the camera, as long as it was in focus, was absolutely fantastic. The camera does struggle in low light. It is not a strong low light performer, and it does not have the ISO performance that a lot of other cameras have these days. And that is an issue with the Micro Four Thirds. The sensor just simply is not large enough to capture all of that light and to be able to utilize all of those pixels that are on a larger sensor in order to capture more light. So that is where you are going to get choked down a little bit with the Micro Four Thirds. While I think the Micro Four Thirds has had a good run, it is just not anymore a sensor size that can really hang with the competitors that are out there. The Sony, the Canon, the Nikon full-frame mirrorless cameras can destroy this camera in low light performance and autofocus performance, and this camera it just cannot keep up. But where they do make up for it is in its ability to capture great video, ProRes internal, and up to 5.7K, which is pretty close to the limit of this sensor size. We're not going to be able to get much higher of a resolution with this sensor size. So the GH6, what are my final thoughts on the GH6? I think for the price point, this is probably one of the better cameras that are out there for video shooters, if you are okay with manual focusing. The amount of lenses that are available for Micro Four Thirds are insane. There's tons of lenses, and the prices have come down significantly on those lenses as there are not as many Micro Four Thirds cameras being produced these days. There are lots of photography style lenses. There are a lot of cinema style lenses available for this form factor. And this camera is a great option for a person who is a video shooter and is fine with manual focusing. If you are a newer video shooter, someone who is not experienced with manual focusing, I highly recommend choosing something else. Go watch my A7 IV comparison video between these two cameras. I think that you probably should go with a camera that can handle some of that autofocus for you. But for those of you that are more experienced video shooters that are okay with manual focusing, this is probably the best bang for the buck that you're going to get, and it has all the features that you want and more. So that's going to do it for my review of the GH6. I think it's a great camera. Definitely not going to get me away from the Sony camp, but there are some features within this camera that I am jealous about, and I'm just going to have to live with that. But let me know what your thoughts are about the GH6 down in the comment section below. What are your thoughts on the Micro Four Thirds, the lack of good autofocus? I would love to just continue the conversation with you guys down there, so let's jump down to the comment section and do that. Until next time, I hope that you have a great day, a great week. Hit that thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you back here soon on Gear and Light. Take care.